Welcome to the Fantasy NASCAR podcast, brought to you by RaceForThePrize.com, home of the Fantasy NASCAR spreadsheet and all the new tools and AI innovations we are building every single day. When I say we, well, it's just me. Today, Daytona Duels 2025. We'll look at the trends. We'll look at the drivers. We'll go over the strategy for DraftKings for the 13th season that we have been doing this. Thought it would be interesting. I don't have time to do this, but you could pull the transcripts from the last decade's worth of Duels podcasts. I wonder if I've ever changed the script any. Nonetheless, we'll do the dance again. Two ways of approaching it. As always, when you build lineups, you could look at it from, hey, who are the drivers that do well at a specific racetrack? Now, sometimes that's not really something you want to look at for super speedways or plate racing. It's all about where are they starting? What is the place differential? Cross their names off. It doesn't really matter. It's arbitrary. The duels are a little bit different, and we can put a little bit more weight behind specific drivers that tend to do well in this race, that tends to be sometimes more conservative and safer in spaces. And we see on the screen some of the trends in front of you. On the left in the green, you can see their DFS finish. So Joey Logano in 2024 in his dual race, he scored the 11th most fantasy points. He finished that race in 7th in 2023. He scored the 2nd most fantasy points in his duel and won the race. You can see that data. So specific drivers is one way to look at it, but as always, when we look at super speedway, it's about maximizing place differential even in the dual races. So we go to the dual trends page, and on here we've got two real categories. What we are looking at, as always, is starting position. Stacked in the back. Well, it's not completely stacked in the back at the duels. If you pay attention to this stuff, you know that. But you do know that there still is a lot of place differential that's going to come into play. It's just how much is too much. Where do we go to? So we look at the data and look at the trends. And so what we can see here in this category is we look at starting position over the last almost decade. And then we see if a car started in, let's say, 8th place, where did it end up finishing in that duel? So we're looking at duel 1. So for example, the car starting in 8th in duel 1 scored the 9th most fantasy points. And we can track that for all these to see if we can find a general trend of where is the place to target. Are we taking guys starting 20th, those long shots trying to race their way in, the bubble drivers? Do they end up in optimal lineups? Or are they just too far out there in a race where there's not a lot of carnage, where they can't really make a lot of gains, and many times their cars lack the speed really to compete with those front runners, really capping their finishing position, and thus allowing them to move forward, but maybe not enough. So we can look at the trends and see where do we want to pick drivers, where are places to avoid. Obviously, you see up here the driver on the pole, because once you've won the pole in the qualifying, you're locked in for the Daytona 500, unless, of course, you wreck in your duel, have to change cars, then you lose your pole position. So often we see the driver starting first in dual races, drop to the back, and they don't score very many fantasy points. Now, like for example, 2023, the pole winner was, and we can go over here and look, Alex Bowman. He says, I'm going to hang on to my position. He just drops to the back. He finishes 17th. That's what we see over here in this chart. Where's the driver start? Where do they finish? And we see often the driver starting up front go to the back. Some say, no, I'm out here to race. Like in 2017, on the pole was Chase Elliott. He was there to race. He finishes the race in first, and he also scores the most fantasy points. But overall, the general trend here is for the driver starting first to finish 13th on the DFS scoreboard. And that Chase Elliott was the only example of the pole sitter in Duel 1 ending up in a top 6 or an optimal lineup 13% of the time. So if we are using the Fantasy NASCAR spreadsheet and trying to navigate the landmines, you really want to stay away from that front row. It's just not hitting very much. And you can see as the list goes down here. So right here, we're looking at Duel 1. How often does a specific starting position end up in an optimal lineup? And it's pretty balanced, but it's definitely not stacked in the back. We are seeing the car starting second 3 times they've hit. Not that much, but hey, the guy starting fourth 5 times at a 63% clip. It's just a couple place differential. Usually finishes up front, because if these guys are willing to give away or cede position, right, they've got a lot to lose. The guy starting up front, nothing really to lose here. He's going to get just a couple place differentials starting fourth, but he maximizes finishing position. And you say, well, he's only really filling one of the scoring buckets. Well, actually, he's probably getting some laps led in there as well. But even if not getting laps led, still by finishing first or second, really maximizes finishing position points. And at the end of the day, there's probably not a lot of fantasy points on the board. No one really scores. So he may not necessarily score the most fantasy points, as we see here. Fourth most, fifth most, sixth most, fifth most. But by grabbing those two positions, finishing up front, squeezes into the optimal lineup 63% of the time. And again, that trend holds out when we look at both dual races. 10 times that spot has hit. Now, we go down here further, we've got some more safer plays. But again, you're seeing just a mixture of anyone starting in the top 10, really taking it home. The sweet spot, as we've seen over the years, for whatever reason, is 12 in dual one. 6 times it has hit 75% of the time. The driver starting 12th is able to creep up enough and get some place differential. And for whatever reason, this driver has finished pretty solidly in the top 5, top 6. And to be honest with you, you really need a top 5 finish from all of your drivers. That tends to be the case. And you can use the spreadsheet to actually identify, how many times did drivers starting 15th or back end up in a top 6 lineup? How many times did they? I'll show you that little feature if you want to get the Fantasy NASCAR spreadsheet at racefortheprize.com. It's $20. You can do it. Did you buy my son a Happy Meal this month? Come on, man. Monday night's karate night. We need to get that Happy Meal for him. You always throw in a little extra, so I guess I'll Diet Coke too while I sit and watch him eat. We're poor. We so poor. We so poor. Oh, well. Maybe someday if this spreadsheet ever takes off, I'll be able to buy him a Switch. But for now, we're just building our own video games. Kind of reminds me of my dad when we were poor and broke. And everybody else had the cool toys. And my dad would just make the toys for me. Did you ever have to live through that experience? Good bonding experience, but you're always like, this is not the same as everybody else's. And you didn't really appreciate it at the time. You also didn't really know how poor you were at the time. But here I am. Instead of building toys, we were building video games. Unless you give me some money. All right, let me show you a feature. So right here, what I'm doing is, you read the note, finish worse than the number in BA1 and still got in a top 6 DFS score. So let's say you're stacking in the back with a pure punt. You want a guy starting 20th. You think, if he can just go forward to the 14th, move a little bit further. Let's say finishes outside the top 15. So how many drivers finishing outside the top 15 ended up in optimal lineups? Yeah, none. Pretty much none. It's a 0. Nobody. So if you're taking one of those guys in the back, you got to envision them getting pretty far forward. I'm going to maximize place differential. Well, they better finish better than 15th. How about 10th? So this driver finished worse than 10th. So say you start 20th, they finish 11th. That's 9 place differential points. Still not hitting. You've got to get a guy in the top 10. Let's say finish worse than 8. Now we've got 2. It's starting to pop. Again, if you look at the general trends at these dual races, they've got to get up front. You've got to maximize finishing position. Stacking in the back can work. And we can look at that over here. So what this will do is start it further back than the number in BA1. So yeah, you can stack in the back if it's a good driver. That can get up into close to the top 5. Helio Castroneves, probably not going to want to risk that race car. No point in that. And even if he did, you think it's getting up there? You worry, could Anthony Alfredo really get his car up into the top 7? We know Beard Motorsports has been good at super speedways, and he can race his way into the race. He doesn't really need to finish 7th to get into the race, or 6th, or 8th. He doesn't even really need a top 10 to get into the race. So why push it? And even if he does get a top 10, I don't think he will, Is he going to score enough fantasy points? And the answer is the guys starting 10th that get to 5th end up being just a little bit better plays. Salary's often pretty soft. And so we could see that if we look at drivers starting, let's say, further back than 15th, we get a couple. We got one here. It's not very often. And it's got to be specific guys. So we did get Tyler Reddick that did it. We did get Carson Hocevar that did it. We did get Corey LaJoie, who started deep in the pack. So if you are going to stack in the back, don't stack in the back. If you're going to take someone in the back, make sure it's a driver that you can get behind, like a Ricky Stenhouse, someone who is likely to get 10 place differential points, not a guy in the back that's just trying to race his way in. Todd Gilliland did it. So let's not go completely to the back. Let's say 11th. That's where we start to see, all right, maybe it's not stacking the back, maybe it's mid-pack. You get 16 drivers that started further back than 11th that ended up getting into the optimal lineup. We look at 2024. Look, we got 4 right here, a handful here. You got Chris Buescher, several seasons starting further back, getting forward enough, getting into the optimal lineup. Austin Dillon pulling the same thing off. So just a little feature there to help you figure out, if I'm focusing on starting position, where do I really want to target? I think the main takeaway, and you're going to want to pore over this data more at racefortheprize.com, is to really look at trends and patterns and find a place where you feel comfortable. But obviously, you're going to want to see what the starting grid is as well. But having a good idea of where the driver should be before we have the names is definitely going to be beneficial. Just understanding that you really don't want to load up on the back unless, of course, it is a driver who is going to get up into that top 6, top 7. Because as I've said, when we look at DFS rank versus finishing position, we can do that over here. I believe I got it on this one. So start versus actual finish. No, that's not what I want. Thought I had finish. Well, actually here. Yeah, finishing position versus their DFS. So the drivers that finished 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Where did they end up in terms of DFS scores? And as you can see, the driver that finishes first always ends up in the optimal lineup. The driver that finishes second always ends up in the optimal lineup. Third, fourth, fifth. Misses a couple times when we get to fifth. But what the general trend is, the optimal lineup is made up mainly of drivers finishing somewhere in that top 7. We're not seeing a couple times. Look, the guy that finished 8th, we're not seeing big time place differential. We go down to the bottom. This is a more unique way of, like, say you take a guy, stack in the back around here, he's starting in 20th-ish, but finishes, 12th, 13th, 14th. They're just on the outside of being optimal. They're not optimal, obviously. The driver finished 12th, ended up with 8th most fantasy points. It's not good enough. This guy finishes 11th, not good enough. This guy, the top 10 day, just 9th on the scoreboard. Hits a couple times, but again, like what we're seeing here with this pattern is, while we love looking at starting position at plate differential, and we do favor specific drivers in a dual race, really one of the biggest things you have to approach this race with is, can this guy get a top 6 or a top 7? If you don't envision him getting a top 6 or 7, first of all, you look at the specific driver. Then you look at their starting position. And then you can make the decision on whether you want to roster him or not. But so we go back to like Anthony Alfredo off the top of my head. Do I envision any outcome this weekend or on Thursday night where Alfredo finishes top 6? It's very few times I see that happening. And so I cross him off my list. Even Jimmy Johnson, I don't necessarily think, when we're looking at those bubble drivers, when we try to project who's going to be starting in the back, I believe that's a big question you have to ask yourself as you're going through every pick. Can you get a top 6? because the majority of the optimal lineups in these dual races are the drivers that finish top 6. Yeah, it's a super speedway and anyone can get up there, but it's not a super speedway like, crazy cars that you typically see. We can get some freight trains. We can get some locked in lap turning, lack of movement, and people hold spaces, hold places, and just hang on in races. I was trying to, do I want to do a 4th rhyme? Could I even come up with one? Anyway, so again, I think a useful tool here in the Fantasy NASCAR spreadsheet, racefortheprize.com, $20 for February, is to look and see, the pattern of if a driver finishes 5th, what did he do in DFS? And you can see all of that right there. All right, we'll close out by just looking at who has raced well at these races in the past. And we'll first look at it in terms of DFS output. So over the last decade or so, who's been the best in DFS scoring? And it's Logano, with all these solid days in terms of most fantasy points, 2nd, 4th, 1st, 2nd, 1st. And it's not a surprise, it's Penske. Gilliland, just once, but hey, still works. Chris Buescher's been pretty good at scoring fantasy points in duels. Chase Elliott, Austin Dillon. Kyle Larson hasn't been quite terrible. These aren't necessarily locked and loaded plays, as you can see if you look at the screen. Larson, 14th most, 10th most, 9th most, 9th most. So it's not like, oh, lock them in. I mean, if there was, you might lock in. I feel pretty comfortable with Logano. You'd feel pretty comfortable with Chris Buescher and Chase Elliott. But there's only so much comfort you can feel at a super speedway. The numbers aren't that great on the screen, but we also have to take a step back and realize it is a super speedway, and it is the duel. So you can wreck, and you can just get stuck into it's an exhibition, who cares, don't mess up the car type of situation. And so stats aren't really the greatest. So those are some of the names you can see. It's probably a little bit more beneficial to see, well, where are they actually finishing these things? And so we'll look. This isn't the latest player pool because that entry list is not out yet. So we're just looking at some names that were in the sheet already. And we'll look at dual finishes over the last decade. And if we average it out, Logano's been your number 1 contender. Hocevar, you got a small sample size there. But Chase Elliott with 4 top 5s in a row. Basically a top 10 machine. Kyle Larson, solid top 10 machine. Maybe not maximizing fantasy points, but again, if we approach this with question 1 of, can the driver get a top 6? Well, Kyle Larson fits that criteria. And it's going to be a matter of your next step in the flow chart of, all right, well, where is he starting? And where is everyone else starting? Could, maybe you say to yourself, oh, he's starting too close to the front. Okay, but there is another subset to that category of, all right, well, who's going to outscore him? And if you don't see other drivers getting to the top 6, if you don't see other drivers maximizing points, then you can say to yourself, all right, I don't think he's really going to maximize points, but he's going to score more points than another driver if he gets a top 6 and they get a top 8. Buescher, as we mentioned, been very solid. A lot of top 10s in this race. Dillon struggled of late. Used to be putting up pretty good numbers. Used to be a pretty solid super speedway driver. I don't think he's lost anything. You know how it goes. I mean, he did win a Daytona Summer race recently. It's just the way the streaks happen. You've seen this. We've all been around long enough to know, the greatest plate racers go through slumps. And they come great again, they go through slumps. Just the way it is. There's no rhyme or reason. There's no magic. I think that'll do it. Plenty of pretty good data there to help you out building your duels, trends, approach. I really appreciate you guys stopping by the podcast, liking the videos, subscribing, sharing, leaving positive comments, interacting, and also PayPal, Venmo, Cash App. $20, or you can just give tips. But $20, throw it my way. Get you in on all the duels action, Daytona action, Atlanta action. Big season coming up. It's not the same old fantasy NASCAR spreadsheet, although you do get the same stuff. But we are advancing, we are progressing, we are innovating, and when I say we, it's me. I'm just working pretty hard for you, the people. And, well, I guess it is we. It's the AI and me really working together to code and program, and to scrape and design all kinds of innovative tools that really could take the fantasy NASCAR spreadsheet at racefortheprize.com to the next level and really give you a leverage and an edge. I mean, I just don't see anyone else doing this. You see people still doing the same old stuff, same old cheats. And that's cool. It's fine. Look, I did a lot of the same old stuff too. I just come to the point like, hey, come on, let's go. Let's go forward. What's out there? Let's explore. Let's get to Mars. You know, everyone else can stick around on the moon. It's fine by me. We're going to Mars. We're going to go to Jupiter. We're going to go beyond. It's pretty exciting. Learning new stuff every day. Coming up with new ideas every day. If you've got any ideas, if you've got any strategies, anything that you would like to see implemented, send them my way and we'll see if we can work it in. But I am very impressed so far with the analysis that I get and the data manipulation and interpretation and the way that the AI can just, light speed do things that none of us could do. Really simplifies the process and then allows you to have more fun. Takes away a lot of like the grind work and really allows you to look at the numbers and enjoy playing fantasy NASCAR. So if you enjoy playing it and you don't want to just pop stuff into a sim and whatever, then this is the place for you. RaceForThePrize.com, $20 February. Triple Lights, fantastico.